Доброго дня, це медіа-центр України Одеса. Розпочинаємо наш робочий тиждень і розпочинаємо його з брифінга Віри Ястребової, адвокатки і директорки громадської організації «Східна правозахисна група».
We are starting our day with briefing of Vira Yastrebova, the director of NGO Східна правозахисна група, who will share details about crimes of the occupiers in the occupied territories of Ukraine. Good afternoon. I would like to thank Ukrainian Media Center Ukraine Odesa for the opportunity to speak openly and to communicate information to mass media and Ukrainian citizens about crimes and trends on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine and about the activities of the occupied administrations and also what illegal measures they take against Ukrainians who are now on the occupied territories and are waiting for the liberation. We regularly inform you about the main violations and trends on the temporarily occupied territories, but today's briefing will be dedicated to the latest events where we observe changes on the temporarily occupied territories, namely detention of minors on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. The law enforcement authorities of the occupying country detain minors. Why do they do this? Because they do not support activities and the policy of occupiers on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. There is the new position now, the so-called counselors to the directors of schools who inform about such children. Everyone is well aware about the tragedy that happened on the occupied territory of Ukraine in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, where 2 teenagers were killed. Unfortunately, this is a trend now. Now the occupiers, they try to oppress the activities of the teenagers who do not support them. 169 cases of detained minors have been reported. The parents are threatened to be deprived of their rights, and they are also threatened that children will be deported to the Russian Federation, where they will be raised properly from the Russia's ideology point of view. Passportization is one more method used against minors in Ukraine. So they try to make teenagers to refuse from the Ukrainian citizenship. Children do not agree to do this, and they openly state their position. And unfortunately, the methods of illegal influence are used against them. They try to break children and they try to send them to openly receive Russian passports. In their work with young people, occupiers use a kind of an open method. They organize ceremonies to issue passports to children, and thus they document their crimes against small Ukrainians. And they try to show that they made children to agree to get passports of the Russian Federation. There are detentions on the temporarily occupied territories, and we can see now rise and growth of such detentions during the immunity of the Wagner and Prigozhin. During the immunity and after that, there were searches and arrests of people who cooperated with Wagner, and also people of Prigozhin are now, like Maxim Shugaley, which is the head of the Foundation on Protection of National Values, and who was responsible for voters among former military occupiers who were wounded, and he actually supported Prigozhin. He is now not allowed to come to the so-called Luhansk People's Republic. There are 13 searches and 18 detentions in the Luhansk People's Republic and 24 detentions in Donetsk People's Republic. As for passportization, unfortunately, the process is ongoing, but taking into consideration the refusal to receive Russian passports among Ukrainians, the Russian Federation has established kind of migration prisons on the temporarily occupied territories. On the occupied territories of Ukraine, unfortunately, following Putin's orders on deportation of children who are now came into force for the Kremlin authorities and their supporters. Those people who do not want to gain Russian citizenship and to denounce Ukrainian citizenship, there is the way to work with them. These people will be detained first and then deported. But for this, in the so-called Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic, occupiers create prisons which are called the temporarily detention centers, where people expect for deportation. And all locals will be subject to deportation if they refuse to get Russian passports. Taking into consideration the fact that there is the increased number of deserters in those military units, armed units that are involved in fighting against Ukraine, the occupiers, they do everything possible to detain such people on the territory of Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, which are now occupied. Law enforcement authorities of the occupiers conduct searches in houses and apartments of locals. They detain and interrogate men who are blamed in committing crimes against the Russian Federation. So they use all possibilities to organize detentions, and after that they hold illegal interrogations to identify deserters. So-called law enforcement bodies of the occupiers terrorize locals, saying that they try to hide deserters. The forced mobilization is still ongoing. Unfortunately, everyone has already heard that occupiers openly speak about demilitarization of students on the occupied territories. But it should be said that from the first day of the full-scale invasion, they have been denying the fact of mobilization of students. Now they speak about demobilization, so they lied. But the students now have to sign orders of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, and now they have to sign documents about their demobilization. This means that Russia does everything possible to involve all strata of the population in the war against Ukraine. We've already told about the forced passportization that started with the start of the full-scale invasion, and that was before. But now occupiers force locals to gain passports and to denounce Ukrainian citizenship of Ukraine. In the last 2 weeks, we have seen the increased number of detentions among locals who don't have passports. And at the checkpoints, some people are detained, there are searches, people are interrogated, and after that their property is seized, and if it's a vehicle, it is sent to a special parking lot. It is very difficult to find people who have been detained and arrested because there is no information where these people are sent and what law enforcement unit detains such people. The situation is unclear. Under conditions of terror, locals also face the lack of medication because the occupiers have failed to organize the work of drugstores, and they have been facing significant problems with this. People with chronic diseases do not have access to those medications which they need for their treatment all the time. The situation is also worsened by the fact that there is a limited access to doctors. The occupiers give priority to treatment of mercenaries and soldiers of the Russian Federation who are wounded in fights against Ukraine. There is a crisis with the prices on food in shops on the occupied territories of Ukraine. The Russian Federation gives priority to other measures. For them, the ideology campaign is of more importance. They organize mass events to show that allegedly on the occupied territory the peaceful life has been restored, but this is not true. The prices in the shops are very high. The Russian Federation does not provide access to social payments for people who have not received Russian passports. And it is impossible to gain social support for people there. That's why, as of today, Ukrainians are on the verge of survival, and the situation is catastrophic. The occupiers have been implementing measures aimed at forming repressive machine of law enforcement bodies. They create the investigative committees and other law enforcement bodies that have the main task of the Kremlin government and Putin himself, that is to control local population, to introduce repressions against Ukrainians, and also to form the image of legitimization of the illegal activities on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. There is the phobia against Ukraine, and those people who have Ukrainian books in their libraries are endangered now because occupiers believe that everything which is of Ukrainian nature is a threat. If people have some classic books of Ukrainian writers or authors, is considered as their support of Ukraine, and people should expect arrests, tortures, interrogations, and they will also try to bring these people to liability to create the image of the Russian Federation that everything which is not in line with the official position and policy of the occupiers shall be destroyed. The Russian Federation also looks for so-called spies on the occupied territories, and the repressions against locals are never-ending. Law enforcement bodies of occupiers use the special system. Every month, they must find 15 so-called spies on the occupied territories in every region, in every oblast. To fulfill the plan, they organize searches and detentions. Why 15 people? Because the system of law enforcement bodies on the occupied territories has been structured to the following: that the representatives of the occupiers' law enforcement bodies should be encouraged to fulfill some plan. That's why all Ukrainians on the occupied territories are now in danger, because no one could guarantee that they could escape this. Now we know about 8 cases of detained citizens of Ukraine on the temporarily occupied regions of Luhansk Oblast, and this is the information for the last 2 months. On other occupied territories, there are also detentions. The verification and identification of whereabouts of these people is ongoing. Now we are trying to keep in touch with people there, but it is getting more and more difficult every day, because the occupation authorities control all contacts of locals to prevent their contact with people from the controlled territories of Ukraine, government-controlled territories. But people still hope, they still wait for peace, they're still waiting for the Ukrainian control over their homeland. Unfortunately, this is a price people should pay for being deceived by the Russian world. And I would like to say that almost everyone there now against Russian. The terror against Ukrainians there is made by so-called Kremlin tourists who arrive to the occupied territories of Ukraine to ensure and impose Putin regime there. We have been reported that the main positions there are occupied by Russian citizens who arrive from the Russian Federation. Doctors and teachers are actively involved. These are also people who arrive from the territory of the Russian Federation, because they cannot find Ukrainians who are ready to control their compatriots. I would also like to add that Putin's crime and the crime of Lvova Belova is ongoing against Ukrainian children. There is the order of the International Criminal Court for the deportation of Ukrainian children to the Russian Federation for the kidnapping, but unfortunately it is ongoing. The occupier has changed its tactics. So there is increased number of groups of such children with a decreased number of children in every group. This means that the Ukrainians, they disperse small Ukrainians on the territory of the Russian Federation to make it even more difficult for their relatives, for the organizations who are trying to find and return children to Ukraine. They try to make this process impossible. It is also known that the Russian Federation changes their birth certificate for the deported children. These children receive Russian documents. This means that they kidnap Ukrainian children from Ukraine. It is also very important to note that they have been preparing the so-called pilot project. There are still orphans on the territory of the so-called Luhansk People's Republic. And they are going to communicate information about these orphans to the families in the Russian Federation. But I would like to say that those who want to adopt Ukrainian children on the Russian territory should be aware about the fact that these children have been kidnapped and illegally deported to the Russian Federation. And this means that if the families are involved in the process, they are involved in Russian and Putin's crime. This is briefly as of the latest trends on the human rights violations and other processes on the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. People there are waiting and looking forward for the counteroffensive, and they just rely upon the armed forces of Ukraine, and that will be able to release people from the terror which they have been facing there. Thank you for your report, Vira, and I hope that the next time when we see you, we will have more information about how the attempt of the mutiny by the head of Wagner private military company could change the situation with the human rights on the temporarily occupied territories. Thank you. Thank you. That was the briefing of Vira Yastrebova, the director of the NGO Skhidna Pravozakhisna Group. Stay with us. At noon, we will have with us an archaeologist, Sergei Nemtsev, who will tell us how they should study what has been found on the bottom of Kakhovka Reservoir. Stay tuned.